Hi, Professor Wright. My project is over the Salem witch trials of 1692. Some background on this: the Salem witch trials of 1692 was a period of mass hysteria and paranoia where multiple women and some men were tried and unfortunately executed on the basis of being a supposed witch. This takes place between February and November of 1692, although this time span expands for other colony or other cities outside of Salem. They occurred into June of 1693. Unfortunately, more than 150 people were victims and 20 were executed, and this took place in Salem town and village in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Here you can see in yellow the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the location of Salem. So the timeline of the Salem witch trials takes place in two different waves. I like to say that these waves are an influx in accusations and victims. These first three complaints occurred at the very end of February, and then throughout March, 4 more claims were issued, and then throughout April and May, there was a total of 69 accusations, but this marks the end of the first wave. Actually, 90% of the accusations took place during these first 3 months. During June, only 4 more suspects had been named, and in August, 21 more cases came, and this is where the second wave begins. In September, the cases peaked and 30 more suspects were named. After this, cases declined once it became October and only 4 people were recognized. Cases come to a halt after November when the last 3 people were charged. So contrary to popular belief, witch trials took place all across Massachusetts, not just Salem. This proves that the Salem witch trials was not an isolated incident, it was just the most important and the most famous. Some of these towns were Gloucester, Chelmsford, Billerica, Boston, Andover, and even all the way into Maine. Arguably the most important in all of these was Andover, as I will cover later on. So Andover was located northwest of Salem village and town, and after June, Andover actually became the core of witch hunting. The only resident charged prior to June was named Martha Garrier. In July, there was a total of 7 new cases. August had 12 more suspects named, and then by September, there's a total of 20 victims of the witch hunting. And here's a map, once again, with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in red, and you can see how close Andover actually was to Salem, and you can actually see where Gloucester was as well. A total of 43 victims were named in the witchcrafts in Andover, Massachusetts, but despite this, many speculate that the number is actually quite higher due to the fact that the legal system back then was not as thorough as it is today, and they did not take extensive records. It is believed that Andover actually had more victims than Salem town and village combined, but despite all this, all things considered, Salem town and village was the most important in the events of the witchcraft trials. Here's where most of the trials were held and where testimonies were given. And then here is a picture of Andover from the Andover Historical Society. So the legal system actually failed a lot of the people in the witchcraft trials in a really big way. The governor at the time established a special court known as Oyer and Terminer, and this means to listen and to determine. Legal documents do not exist for everyone convicted of witchcraft, but even if these records do exist for these individuals, they are not complete. Before and during the witch trials, the court of Oyer and Terminer relied on spectral evidence. This is evidence centered around the belief in the supernatural, but the problem with this was that relying on spectral evidence is that it validated the behavior of the afflicted who were claiming to be attacked by witches, and people claimed to have special sight, so to be able to see these witches. Therefore, the majority of evidence at this time was spectral and not factual. One of the causes of the Salem witchcraft, a lot of people believe to be religious paranoia. Most of the population of Salem town and village were Christian, therefore most people associated magic with satanic evil. People commonly use the devil to explain personal misfortunes and failures in the colonies. All education was even religious back then, and then court judges and magistrates used religion to justify execution and convicting people for witchcraft. And what kind of led up to this was that starting in 1670, the church started preaching pessimistic and apocalyptic sermons. And then what seemed to make everyone even more paranoid with religion and witches is that when the colony's charter was revoked in 1684. The people believed that this was a result from failing to show England that they were living a life with godly purpose. A big thing that a lot of people don't know about the Salem witch trials is that race was actually involved, whether implicitly or explicitly. White people accused African Americans of witchcraft, but none were actually ever executed, and so this demonstrates African American insignificance in the eyes of white people. African Americans were involved in trials of witchcraft, but usually by implication instead of direct involvement. In Salem, there were 3 African Americans who were accused as witches: Mary Black, Candy, and Old Pharaoh, and on the next slide we'll go over the details of all 3 of those victims. Old Pharaoh was accused of being one of the afflictors of Mercy Lewis, who was one of the 3 accusing girls. Unfortunately, we do not know the fate of Old Pharaoh. Mary Black refused to confess to witchcraft, but she was yet another who was supposedly afflicting the accusing girls. After the witch trials had become a thing and passed in 1693, she was actually released by a proclamation from the governor. Candy confessed to the crime of witchcraft, and she actually proved this by pulling out a handkerchief with knots tied in it, which would be associated with voodoo, and pieces of clothing, and then grass was associated with messing with agriculture, and cheese was associated with messing with some of the cows. And then African religious practices were consistently and constantly looked over on suspiciously by white people. Africa was looked as a land filled with heathens, demons, and godlessness. They believed that Africans worshipped the devil in Africa, and they brought it with them to the New England. Africans were seen to possess lesser morals than white people. They could not control their draw to Satan and wickedness, and they were inherently connected to the worship of Satan. So if African Americans were so barbaric and evil, why weren't more of them tried and executed? So this plays into the religious paranoia that African Americans were seen as property, and therefore losing them would be like losing possessions. It would also be costly, and losing them would be like losing capital investments because enslaved people were so valuable back then. So here we go into the mythology of Tituba. Many writers have wrote and portrayed Tituba as either African American or mixed with Indian, but this is actually not true, as the records indicate that Tituba was nothing but Indian. Tituba is from Barbados and is here where she was exposed to African influences. She was from an emerging Creole culture, and Christian religion was not practiced on the island, so occult and non-Christian acts were practiced here. Tituba was enslaved by Samuel Parris, a plantation owner, and his daughter Betty Parris and a girl named Abigail Williams began to exhibit bizarre behavior, which starts Tituba's story. Once these girls were showing these strange behavior, Tituba's neighbor, Mary Sibley, appealed to her to try to use counter magic on the girls to cure them. They prepared a witch cake, which consisted of rye meal and the girls' urine, and this was supposed to be fed to the family dog, who would then reveal who was torturing the girls. This type of magic, including bodily fluids, was actually common in tribal cultures. It was typical of South American sympathetic magic, and this type of magic was actually supposed to protect against evil. And then contrary to popular belief, Tituba did not introduce magic to the girls. They even admitted themselves that they dabbled in the occult and tried to read their own fortunes. Tituba did not initially confess to witchcraft. It was only after a private meeting with Paris that she did confess. So this leads a lot of people to believe that he coerced her and beat her severely into a confession. Tituba more than likely indicated that others were practicing witchcraft as well to divert her attention away from herself, but this effectively started witch hunts outside of Salem as well. So gender in the witchcraft trials are a big thing. Women were believed to be less than and weaker than men, and therefore they were more susceptible to make themselves sign over to the devil. Women were descendants of Eve, so they were easily able to turn away from God. This was because through the devil they could supposedly gain great economic power. Men believed women were so weak that they could give themselves to the devil without even realizing it. When women were convicted of witchcraft, they had to be searched for a witch's mark, usually on their breasts, genitals, and underarms, and this job had to be trusted to a woman for purity's sake, but often these women were suspected of witchcraft themselves as well. Men were considered stronger both physically and mentally, and this is evidenced by when the judge were witnessing the girls being tortured before their eyes. They didn't seem bothered or scared at all. And overall, women were victims of the witchcraft trials because they were just easier targets than men were. So, in modern witches in today's society, despite the fact that the Salem witch trials were regarded as silly paranoia, hysteria, and most of all a tragedy, people are still concerned about witches and witchcraft today. When Hillary Clinton ran for Senate in 2000, she was frequently portrayed as a witch. In cartoons, she was portrayed as stalking children and even performing magic on them. Even when the Harry Potter books came out, critics claimed that they were pushing children toward the occult, and they claimed that it was glamorizing witches and witchcraft. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Here is my list of references.